Hillman, when he talks about this relational self, the self as the internalization of community, he means it as informed by Adler's notion of social interest. And Adler himself said social interest is not just an interest in others. It's not just an interest in the betterment of humanity. It's connection to the larger ecological world that we live in. And Hillman wanted to move in that way. He mentions that as well. And he says the most significant issue that we have is the crisis, the ecological crisis. He says that in many places, that is the issue. And the way we solve that, he says, is love of the world.
Michael Sipiora, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast, and particularly for this series I'm doing that is honoring the 50th anniversary of James Hillman's Revisioning Psychology. It's the first time we're meeting, but I'm really excited to talk with you. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, for people who don't know of you and your work, I wonder if you could just offer a little introduction, a little bit of background.
I met Hillman in '78. I went to the University of Dallas after completing a bachelor's and master's in phenomenological philosophy at San Jose State. Very much into Heideggerian phenomenology and still am. And then took coursework with Hillman and also worked for his publishing company for 6 or 7 years. Started packing books and ended up being director of marketing sales and learned a lot from Hillman about how to do business. We did book conventions together and so on. I taught at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh for 22 years, which is the mothership of human science programs. Started in '59, and a lot of the programs, including University of Dallas, were started by some of its graduates. And I taught Hillman there the 22 years that I was there, as well as always teaching Heideggerian approaches, both teaching directly being in time for years, as well as psychologists like Maynard Boss and Jan Vandenberg, phenomenological psychologist. And then I was at Pacifica Graduate Institute for 13 years. They lured me back out to California, where I'm from, and it was I hated to leave the department at Duquesne. It's a great department, but Pittsburgh versus California, well, kind of California won out, and of course still have family and friends here. So I left Pacifica about 3 years ago and continue as a therapist in private practice.
Great. When I was, you sent me some materials to read, and thanks for that. I was also just trying to do some research on you by way of podcasts or videos that you might be featured in, and there's not a lot. I found one video where I think you were hosted by some Brazilians.
Yes.
Yeah, and you gave a great talk and a great kind of dialogue with some of the people that were in the room.
That
And
was a lot of fun.
it appeared to me that you understand Brazilian Portuguese. Now, is that the
No,
case, or was there an offline translation going on?
offline translation. Languages are my Achilles heel. Yeah, no, I speak English relatively well, but that's it. When I try to speak German, my German friends say, "Oh, we can speak English." Or I try and speak Spanish, they go, "That's okay."
Yeah, I had the same experience while living in Montreal and trying out my French. They'd always just go, let's just speak English, make it easier for everyone.
Yeah, my language requirement for my doctorate was in German, and Hillman had given me an article from Guggenville Craig to translate on the possible and the impossible of the training of Jungian analysts. And it took years for me to translate that article. I finally did. And Guggenville was very gracious. He was a gracious man. He liked the translation.
One of the ways I've been starting these conversations is to ask people where they were, what they were doing, what they were up to when they first encountered Hillman's work. And you've alluded to that, but I wonder if you could go into that a little more, like, what was it like to encounter him and his work at that time?
Well, I went to the University of Dallas because it was only one of two schools that was in phenomenological psychology. The other was Duquesne, where I eventually taught. And I had no idea who Hillman was. So they said, well, James Hillman is on the faculty. So I bought Myth of Analysis, looked at it, but didn't really dig into it. Um, my first day on campus, I ran into a man who would be a good colleague of mine, Dan Chappell, written a couple of books. And I said, well, what about Hillman? And he said, he's a seminal thinker. And that just hits the nail on the head. Um, my first class with him, it was on psychological tradition and pretty much reading his sources, going back from Heraclitus, Plotinus, Procreus, all the way through to Vico. And it was mind-boggling. And I think it was only maybe 20 years later that I had some understanding of Vico. Hillman, I would not say was at that time a great teacher. He became one later, I think, at Pacifica. But he was, you know, Hillman at that time was someone who, of course, had a towering presence. I first read Revisioning in another class with Robert Sardello. So that's why, and I think Revision's the kind of book that you throw it against the wall a few times and go, what is this guy talking about? And I was amazed that he would choose the Neoplatonic tradition, because that was not a tradition I was very sympathetic towards coming from phenomenology. But over time, it certainly grew on me, and I struggled with it and struggled with it. And Hillman, I felt, was always willing to talk with you if you were serious. If you wanted to showboat, forget it. He had no time for that. He didn't want to be anybody's daddy. He didn't want to give people approval. But if you were serious, he would talk with you. And then early on, kind of a funny story. My first year, it was when Puer Papers was in press, and he needed someone to do an index. And this was before computers. So he targeted me, so I was a little compulsive. And Randy Severson, who was the editor of Spring, came and talked to me, and so I took it on. And it was 8 different authors, 16 different essays. I was going crazy doing it. And I call up Hillman and say, Dr. Hillman, I'm falling behind in all my classes. They say, oh, come over and we'll talk about it. I do that 2 or 3 times. He finally says, come out on Sunday and play baseball with us. That's what you need. You need to get out and play baseball. And so that was my first encounter with Hillman. Hillman would utilize people in various ways. And then I started working for the publishing company, packing books in the basement of a building, and eventually became director of marketing and sales, and did what I regret, although it was appropriate at the time. I spent quite a bit of time with Hillman, traveling, driving places, going to different cities, setting up conventions, book selling stuff. I didn't feel it was appropriate to talk ideas with him. He was my boss at that time. And so we had conversations, but there's so many things now I wish I would have talked to him about, but I respected that boundary. In class, though, definitely talked ideas. And then I was able to be in that kind of now famous seminar, big, it wasn't a seminar, it was a lecture class on alchemy that he did. And that was quite phenomenal. That's when Hillman at that time was at his best, on a stage, thinking. He would think with you. And, I'm moving my hands now because Hillman used to think with his hands. He would always be doing that. And he was great. One of the highlights of that period was Hans-Georg Gadamer, the famous phenomenological philosopher, student of Heidegger, was a visiting professor. And Hillman invited me out to dinner with him and Pat Berry, who was married to the time. And Pat Berry and I went through coursework together at the University of Dallas, and they're a student. And I tried to get Gadamer and Hillman to mix it up because I knew where they had distinction. They were such European gentlemen. They were deferential to each other, and they kind of told stories about Heidegger. And I hadn't realized that Hillman had been to some of Heidegger's lectures, although he wasn't impressed. But that was a really great experience. And then I think the last class I had with him was on mythology. Everyone presented different perspectives. I took up Holderman and the idea of the withdrawal of the gods, because I think that's a place of kind of friction. How present are the gods here? Holderlin says in Bread and Wine, they're far above our doubting heads. Our Cartesian sense-making has allowed them to disappear. So that's the theme I've been struggling with. How do we look at the extraordinary, the divine? Where is it today? Hillman then moved to Thompson, Connecticut, and soon after that, I moved to Pittsburgh to teach at Duquesne. Didn't have a great amount of contact with him here and there. He sent me a copy of the book that he did with Michael Mead, the poetry book,
Hmm.
on Regs of the Heart. That was very nice of him. And then he did publish the translation of the Guggenbill article I had. And then I reconnected with him in person when he came to Pacifica, and that was, the cancer had hit him, but we thought he beat it, and he came back, and it was nice to spend time with him. And also there was a conference that Stan Marlin put together in Pittsburgh before that, and I got to introduce him to my son, and one of the stories I told to Dick Russell, which I think said a lot about Hillman, is that at Spring, the publishing company, very small company. I mean, we had 6 or 7 employees, and most of us were graduate students, and we were poor, and we needed medical insurance. So I went to him and I said, Dr. Hillman, let's do this. And he said, well, Michael, if you can go find me the best policy that includes me and Pat, I'll do it. And he put his money where his mouth was. We got health care. And I think
Great.
that was a mark of his integrity. He could be a tough businessman, but I got to say, I look back, he was good to me. We would have clashes, and I still have a letter he wrote me about kind of putting me in my place, get the chip off my shoulder kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I realized he didn't have to do that. It was a very kind thing that he did.
Hmm.
And so we had a good relationship. And towards the end, I think, an affectionate one between us.
Yeah, nice. Thanks. I gotta ask, how was Hillman as a baseball player?
He was okay. I didn't play a lot with him, but he loved the game. God, did he love the game. And when Stan put together the conference in Pittsburgh, Hillman said, I don't want to listen to all the papers. Let's just get together and have a party and go to a baseball game. And that's what they did. And the kind of discussions we had were structured as innings in a baseball game.
That's great. You sent me an article that you published a little while back called The Troubled World in the Practice of Psychotherapy.
Mhm.
And you open it with this quote from Tony Barton, who I don't know, but the quote is, what does it take to be a therapist? Being a good person and knowing at least the last 200 years of cultural history. Fantastic. I mean, Hillman would probably say, well, let's go to at least 2,000 years of cultural history in the West, right?
Yeah.
I mean, can you talk about that? Because you mentioned that I think the first course that he gave was on his own kind of psychological family tree going back to Heraclitus.
Yeah.
What did that open up for you and finding out to maybe honoring like who's on your tree?
Well, at first I have to say Tony Barton recently passed, was one of the first faculty members that Adrian von Kalm hired when he started the human science program at Duquesne. And Tony was like the therapist. He knew about everything. And this was one night out drinking. And Tony said 200 years because we think, around 1750 is when the world changed and things were different. We can kind of recognize continuity back to that point, and that's something that Vandenberg talks about, and I think it accords with things that Ivan Illich, who's also been an influence, would talk about. Um, so in one of the pieces I did, I think it was for a collection that Stan did. No, it was a piece on Hillman and Ricoeur on narrative. I talk about archetypal psychology as an insurrection, and going on Foucault that we have subjugated knowledges that have been there in our cultural context but have been lost, repressed, and that I think archetypal psychology under Hillman was an attempt to retrieve those. And he did that not only in his writing, but the books that we would publish from Spring Publication. We had things from Ficino and so on, and older texts, mythological texts. He kept those, he retrieved those traditions because I think they do have a lot to say to us. And like I said, it took me a long time to wrap my mind around Vico, but I see Vico as very important. He took the last stand for the classical tradition
Mm.
against the Cartesian worldview. And within the rhetorical tradition too, which for me, the way I've gone back is the classical rhetorical tradition. which certainly accords with Hillman, but that was my emphasis. And Hillman had asked me for an article on archetypal psychology and Reddick many, many years ago, and I regret that I never gave him one because I think that's a very important strand in the Western intellectual tradition that we can retrieve to our benefit.
Hmm. Yeah, and unearth something of that indigenous psychology, right? That's been lost
Yes,
through the loss of the, I think you call it the vernacular in this
yes,
article. Can you
right.
open that up a little bit? Like, I'd love to start with something of a diagnosis of what's happened in that past 200 years and where our culture's at. And then we can get into how we address that.
Yeah. The vernacular is a term I take from Ivan Illich. Um, and, just the kind of thing that when Illich came to Dallas, Hillman would have, Hillman sent Ivan to me because I was doing marketing. And he said, whatever Illich wants, send him those books. And so I sat with Ivan, we went through the catalog, and he was in Cuernavaca, and it was a kind of detailed instructions for the mail to get him there. And I did that for Yvonne, which he sent me a real nice thank you note. But the vernacular is what people can do for themselves based on their historical and cultural learning. So it's very much a self-sufficiency, and it's got a depth that comes from that history and that place. That vernacular knowledge has been pretty much repressed as we've turned to formal systems since around 1750. And if you think about the changes that happened at the end of the Renaissance with the scientific revolution, rubber hits the road around 1750 with the Industrial Revolution, where those ideas permeate everyday life. And Hillman really tells that story with the how alchemy becomes chemistry at that moment, which is around 1750, around that time, that the sense making that was qualitative gives way to a quantitative sense making, and the real becomes synonymous with what's measurable. In our conversation, we mentioned Robert Romanishin. Romanishin's book on technology tells that story really well. So I think that the the transformation of qualitative sense making into being merely subjective, epiphenomenal, has been a crucial element in that change. And then the turning to formal systems. And I think a good example of that is when the Apple Watch came out, I told my students that they should be horrified because they're going to look at the Apple Watch to tell them about their own bodies. They will give precedent to the Apple Watch over their bodily, concrete, embodied experience. In addition, you need expert information to interpret the material that you get from the Apple Watch. So you've self-alienated at the most profound level, and you think that's an innovation, and it's great. We're
Yeah.
doing this to ourselves. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that echoes what I've been saying about AI. My kind of standard line about AI is that every time you outsource your thinking and creativity to AI, you lose a piece of your soul. And people
Indeed.
think that sounds extreme and alarmist, and I've got to get with the program and see the benefits of this thing. But I got to tell you, like just watching how as people take it on and embrace it and make it more and more a part of their life, I feel like I'm being affirmed in my fear of what it does to the human soul.
Yeah. In my dissertation, which was very much phenomenological on, I was trying to develop a kind of cultural discourse based on the rhetorical tradition and Heideggerian phenomenology um, that would be used in popular media to help people feel a little bit of dis-ease as they picked up technological devices. And back then it was the Walkman. And so I did a critique of the Walkman. You put on the Walkman and you're on the bus and you think, this is great. I have my own private world. I get to do what I want. Number one, you're ingesting packaged material with all kinds of advertising agendas that are implicit in it. In addition, you've cut yourself off from conversation with anyone near you, from being connected to the particular place that you're in. You've self-isolated, self-alienated, and you think that's liberation. It's
Hmm.
crazy. And AI is just the extreme example of that.
Yeah. I wonder if you could tell that piece about, it comes from Hillman, the apple on the table. I love that because I'm sitting in front of an Apple computer right now, and I love it for all of the benefits that it gives me, what it allows me to do, how it allows me to connect with people like yourself. But there's a dark side to it that is often ignored. Can you
Yeah,
just give
and
that riff on that?
sure. And it has to do with where I think Hillman, and this coincides quite a bit with Gingrich's critique of Hillman and the aesthetic response, although I'm not into Gingrich that much, but I think we agree. The world has changed from the world of the mythic Greeks, which Hillman tried to retrieve as if it were still there. The face of technological things no longer shows their depth. And I tried to compare it with, you pick up an apple, and you see that its color, its texture tells you about, is it a good apple to eat? Is it a good apple to cook with? Is it sour? Is it sweet? It shows itself in its appearance.
Right.
But
And can I just extend that? And you maybe think about the tree that the apple came from and the season that preceded the picking of the apple and how it ripened and did it rot on the all of that, right? So
yeah,
there's
it speaks to the story of the rainfall, the sun, all of those things. I just finished Ed Casey's book on plants in place, phenomenological work about understanding that how plants gather place, they give us place. Um, of course, the Apple computer is displaced. It can be anywhere and everywhere, but it's a beautiful thing. Apple are extremely beautifully designed. They're reliable. They're easy to use, but that face conceals all of the strain, the carpal tunnel, the eye strain, all the difficulties that we have as embodied people engaged with the screen, as well as the toll on the environment, their planned obsolescence. You can't replace pieces on Apple computers, and then the rare materials, the exploitation of labor, all that stuff. The world that it gathers is a world of horror, of personal suffering and ecological destruction, but it's concealed by the superficial beauty of the machine itself. And yet, the affordances are so great that you and I still remain on them, even though we recognize these things. So we're really caught in a very difficult place. Heidegger's idea was, and of course, he was not the most sophisticated person with regard to technology, writing as he did in between the 20s and the 50s. But he said to let these technological things into our lives, but not be used up by them, to let them come and go, but retain our integrity, our autonomy. That is the most difficult thing with computer technology because it frames us, it narrates us in a way that is very, very insidious.
so insidious that people don't even recognize how they've internalized machine computer metaphor for their own processes. Like when people say, I've got to process this, well, that's a computer metaphor.
Exactly. I stop my patients all the time from using that. And in psychology, the dominant metaphor is that we are advanced microprocessors. The brain is the hardware, the mind is the software. If there's a problem, you need pharmacological intervention to fix the hardware, the brain, and you need some type of cognitive restructuring, one of those alphabet soup uh, therapies, to reprogram your mind. And it is monstrous. And I always say, I did a PowerPoint years ago where I started with the smiley face, which is everywhere, which I think is again monstrous because a human life is always filled with both suffering and with happiness. Freud made us well aware of that. You know, you open up, you look behind that smiley face, and you find the computer self. And that is, and we adopt it. Like you said, we use that terminology to express ourselves. We understand ourselves in that way. And we don't think that there's any other alternative. And that's one of the values of Hillman, retrieving these vernacular traditions, these repressed traditions from our past. It gives us another way to start to understand what it means to be a human being and how to be a human being.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, as you were just speaking, I was reminded of the early Apple computers that I got on as a graphic designer. And when you would boot it up, the first thing that you're presented with is a picture of the little computer, and it had a smiley face on it. Yeah. It was
And
like putting a happy face on this technology to make it more. And that was a lot of what Steve Jobs and his engineers brought to personal computing, is that the aesthetics of the computer. So they weren't just beige machines anymore, but they were kind of personified in a way and made kind of friendly. You know, the
to
early,
Lisa,
yeah,
yeah, they give them human names, sure.
right. And like the colors of the early iMacs, and they had a handle so you could pick them up and take them with you anywhere. And now, of course, we have laptops, which are ubiquitous. You know, sitting on
Mm,
your lap, radiating your genitals, and who knows what else. You know. Wow. Yeah. It's so
yeah,
insidious.
it is. And yet, there's no way we can't just let it go. It's
Right.
got us. It's working, and that's where people like my friend Glenn, who you've interviewed,
Mhm.
he's really done really good work on trying to understand how to position ourselves with regard to technology.
Right.
Thanks later.
Yeah. And drawing that, well, using like the metaphor of the Borg to talk about AI and technology. Yeah. Really bringing forth that monstrous aspect of it, and how it will take us over if we allow it and we don't preserve our humanity. And so that's an argument for doing some of this cultural research. Like, where do we come from? Who do we come from? What's the soil that we spring from in this culture, and not always just looking forward into the future.
One of the people who has written very succinctly and well on technology is Jerry Mander. Um, his book,
Gerrymander. I mean, interesting
Yeah,
name, right?
yeah,
Gerrymandering.
yeah. His book, Four Arguments for the Elimination of Television, which must have come out around in the 70s, was great. He started as an advertising guy, and he later became known as sort of the godfather of anti-globalization. But in one book, he had 10 suggestions for how to deal with technology. And one of the things he said is don't be an early adopter. The negative, all the information we get about technology comes from the people who have created it and have a vested interest in our taking it up. He said, go slow and watch how it changes your life. And don't believe that once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. And so this idea that we valorize early adopters is delusional. That's a,
Mm,
a mistake. We
yeah,
need to go slow and we need to look at, well, how is our life different with this technology? What's the good side? What's the bad side? And then make prudent choices about how to engage with it. Now, that's a very difficult task, but I think it makes more sense than just going along with whatever Apple gives us as its next iteration of technology.
yeah. Getting caught up in all that excitement generated by the marketing about a new technology. Yeah, I've often resisted that myself. I let my computers become almost obsolete before replacing them in my phones and etc. Yeah, I mean, that's such good advice. And also to not jump on the bandwagon, but also observe how it's affecting others, and
Yes.
just see what's happening. Like my wife was relating to me an article that she read last night on how there's an increased amount of what I think they're calling AI psychosis, people engaging with AI bots that are sold to them as companions that are good for their mental health to help with this sense of isolation. And people are starting to confuse the AI as an aspect of themselves, like some kind of higher self, or even as a God that's coming into being. And by engaging with AI and giving it more data, more information, that you're helping to bring into being this new God. And I mean, it's terrifying
It
to me.
certainly is. It definitely is. The the dilemmas that we face, they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere with regard to technology, and how one has a measured response to technology is, again, not an easy task. Uh, I resisted a smartphone forever. I had a flip phone, and that was all. And in fact, I had to have two flip phones because I had a personal one and one for my practice. You couldn't have two lines on it. But the phone company more and more curtailed coverage, so I couldn't get coverage in there. They made the flip phones so that they would break down,
Yeah.
and I had to go to a smartphone. And it is just, and I try not to text, but people keep texting me. And I send them an email. This is the way I communicate. And I think it's important that we make clear to people, I've chosen to communicate this way. I want to let you know. And then they get to make their choices. But most of us just, we're drawn into this without making a conscious decision about how we want to communicate or even how we want to present ourselves through technology.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I've had to draw those boundaries in my own life. And for me, I draw the line at communicating anything that has a kind of emotional resonance to it. I don't want to be texting about anything that's going to bring up anything emotional, anything that is actually important. Let's use it for kind of practical communication only, and anything else, pick up the phone, let's have a conversation.
When my son was little, he noticed that texting was grammatically incorrect. I mean, he's learning grammar and learning how to write. He goes, what's going on with this? This is not right.
Yeah.
We overlook that. Um, young people now don't know how to read cursive.
Hmm.
They don't know how to tell time on a clock. I mean, they become so indoctrinated into digital technology that other ways of telling time, writing, communicating are foreign to them.
Hmm. And
That's scary.
people don't know how to find their way home without
Um,
Google Maps.
and you can't buy a map anymore. I have a client who used to be a map maker. He says there's no market anymore. No one has maps.
Yeah, so inconvenient, those maps.
And with a map, you're oriented. You know where other things are. With the Google Maps, this is where you go, period.
Yeah, it's within that whatever 3 by 3 screen. That's the level of your context for where you are.
And Americans to begin with know very little about geography or history. I mean, I taught history of Western civilization when I was a graduate student at a community college. And I was teaching them about ancient Egypt. And they said, well, where is, I asked them, do you know where Egypt is? And they said, Egypt. And I said, it's in Africa. And they go, no, it's not in Africa, it's in Egypt.
Well, because Africa is a country over there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's scary. Okay, so that's something of a diagnosis where we're at, you know.
And let me say that one of the things
Yeah.
that is so important about, like you mentioned, I know there's a lot of people here in this area, Central Coast, that are oriented towards archetypal psychology, Jungian psychology, depth psychology, and general phenomenology. And there's a handful of programs and institutes all over the country. They are really important. I would think the most important thing in my career has been I've helped keep alive some of these programs. And that's the thing. We don't want these approaches to die on our watch. They're dissident voices, they're alternative voices, will never be the dominant orientation, but we've got to keep these alive. I would tell my students, we're sort of like the monks in the Middle Ages. We're trying to keep learning alive in the midst of widespread barbarism. And Hillman did a lot for that with his publishing company, with his academic work, with his work as a public intellectual. That, I think, is part of his enduring legacy.
Yeah, and revisioning psychology, it was really him coming out and staking that claim to working on the therapy of ideas, like that impoverishment of deep and rich historical ideas that had been maybe never included in psychology, but definitely had been kind of weeded out, up until the 50s with the behavioral and developmental psychologies, and even he had a critique of the humanistic psychologies.
Hmm. Yeah. And, that was he would critique phenomenology, but was sometimes those were family fights.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Even though he was a phenomenologist, really, I think calling himself that was where, or belonging to something that he might see as a kind of a doctrine or an ism he had an
Yeah.
allergy to, which was just part of his character.
Well, he published Robert Avon's books on his work in Heidegger, which tells you something.
So
He
he
had
did
me re
respect it.
Yeah, he did respect that. I mean, but I one time asked him, so you see in Jung these really sarcastic remarks about Heidegger, that Heidegger must have learned his stuff in a nut house. Well, where did Jung learn his stuff? And then Hillman referred to Heidegger as that most unpsychological man and these kind of derogatory comments. So one
Hmm.
time I asked him, I said, what was that about? Was that because, Hillman got his doctorate at the University of Zurich, where also Boss was teaching. So you had the Jungians and the Dasein's analysis both at the University of Zurich at that time. I said, was that just trying to keep arm's length from those people? And he said, yeah, that's what it was.
Hmm.
We always suspected that he read and knew more Heidegger than he gave credence to, and certainly, this very long friendship and collaboration with Ed Casey, who is one of the premier phenomenological philosophers of our generation. That says a lot too.
Yeah, and it's one of the later lectures that were recorded at Pacifica. It was either the art practice and philosophy of psychotherapy or the Senex and Puer seminar, but he often calls on Ed to give his phenomenological perspective on whatever Hillman was talking about. So there is deep respect there.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
and a lot of confluence between the ideas. I could have written a book on Hillman out of phenomenology and come out with something similar. In fact, I kind of my dissertation was that. And that's important, that there can be different roads to the same destination.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't have much background in philosophy. Like I didn't go to university, and I mainly get my philosophy through people like Hillman. But when I was introduced to phenomenology and spoke to, Robert Sardello, Ed Casey, it occurred to me that phenomenology, what they were speaking about, the quality of experience, was to me, I thought, well, this is like a Western yoga, which is something that I've been schooled in and practiced for many years. It's like paying attention to what's really going on and trying to get through the naming of experience and things like that. Nominalism, which Hillman also critiques in revisioning psychology.
Yeah. I mean, the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty says that phenomenology and psychoanalysis aim at the same latency. They're going after the same thing, the same
Hmm.
depth. They're going different ways, but that's what they're trying to get to.
Latency, yeah, when I hear that word, I just I think of it as I'm a musician and do recording, and we talk about latency as kind of the eruption or interruption of the signal. Like if I play my guitar, the computer may have a bit of latency of a few milliseconds that you can perceive if you're listening to it. I mean, what does latency mean in this case?
But there's the manifest, which shows itself, and the latent, what's underneath it,
Hmm.
that informs the manifest. So sometimes the way the manifest shows itself is to conceal the latent. I mean, Hillman wants to go back to the mythic Greeks, where the latency was manifested in the way that things show themselves, this mythical view, which understood the presence as a disclosure, aletheia as a revealing, truth as a revealing. But we've come to a place where the way things show themselves conceal their deeper or latent meaning, like the latency with regard to the Apple computer that we just talked about.
Hmm.
It's a repressed, it's a concealed latency. And that's why we have to see through things. And for Hillman and for phenomenology, that's provoked by the breakdown of the manifest, which is what symptoms are about.
Hmm.
And that's common between phenomenological psychologists and depth psychologists of all varieties, that symptoms are to be, as Hillman says, listened to, paid attention to. They're disclosive. They're not problems to be solved. You know, when we take them as problems to be solved, we maintain the very problems that give rise to the symptoms to begin with. We've just kept them at bay momentarily. And we know from Freud, symptoms move around. You stop it here. If you don't address it, it comes up there.
Hmm. Yeah, and if you repress it, it'll come back in some monstrous form.
Exactly.
Hmm. Well, this comes to the well, this brings us to like talking about the practice of psychotherapy. Okay, diagnosis. We've got, you know, not like I have to keep restating this, but I feel like we do actually, because things are insidious, and the dominant culture is so powerful, especially when we allow it in so much and we don't block it out. We lose that perspective on what's really going on. In this article that you sent, you asked these questions that you look to address, and I think they're incredible questions and questions that I struggle with myself. So, given this diagnosis, modernity, what's going on, how it's affecting us, how do we, okay, in light of this diagnosis, how do we engage in the practice of psychotherapy? How do we avoid either unintentionally colluding with oppressive social forces or unconsciously foisting social issues onto individuals? How do we support individuals in bearing the suffering that comes from the world into which they are thrown? How do we empower a response that liberates clients to a more humane way of living?
Yeah, that's the challenge. And
And you've been working on this for decades.
yeah, yeah.
Where are
Um,
you at with it now at this stage?
a couple of things. And where do I start? One of the things I do continuously is normalize symptoms so that people don't feel there's something wrong with them, but there is something wrong in their experience. And I think it's very important for people to recognize that that it is very difficult to live a fully human life in a world which is increasingly inhospitable to what the ancients called a good life, a fully human life. So life is difficult in ways that it hasn't been difficult before, in addition to all the other ways that's always been difficult.
Mhm.
So as far as I can, I normalize them, but there's a point at which, there's a limit to that. There is real psychopathology that you have to recognize, but that
Well,
would be
and we
personal.
do have to take personal responsibility for our life to some degree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the choices that you're making in the face of that world that you have to take responsibility for. And being aware that you have choices is a major step forward. Um, I think having people, well, I give the example of, and this I got from my late friend Phil Cushman. And one of the things that I always bring up that Phil would talk about is, and this is in his really groundbreaking essay, the Empty Self from many years ago, that what people find fulfilling are community, shared meaning, and a sense of tradition. And by tradition, he meant a connection to those who have gone before us and those who will come after us. And for example, like, how many people struggle with distant or oppressive or dysfunctional fathers? I mean, it's widespread.
Yeah.
And you've got to work through that. And I mean, I use things like John Bradshaw's work to help people reparent themselves. And I do it more metaphorically. And I don't think we should always have inner children. I think the point is to get that child part of us to grow up and see things from a more rational adult point of view. But you do that work, you take responsibility, you do that work, but then where are you left? You have to recognize that a, a great number of our fathers are the way they are because they're veterans. They've been through the horror of war. We've been at war in the United States for something like we've only not been at war for like something like 4 years out of our history. I mean, and, certainly this is absolutely, unfortunately, continued.
Hmm.
So we have to recognize that as we leave therapy, we should be adamantly anti war. Because war is why our fathers were partly why they were the way they were and why we had the difficulties we had. So helping people run symptoms to ground, as I say, in the world is another part of what we do. Now, you don't do that in a heavy-handed way. You do it the right way. It's not preaching to people, but it's trying to get them to understand the larger context. It's also a matter of making people aware that, what's really at issue in your life is who are you going to be? Are you going to be someone of whom you can be proud? That's the main thing. And that is not an easy thing to do. So, and this I get from Hillman in the Soul's Code. And I think the work that he does on fate there is phenomenal. I mean, some
Yeah,
people think the Soul's Code and Force of Character are Hillman light. I don't think so at all.
I don't think
I,
so either.
because in Dallas, the whole project was to take these ideas out of the ivory tower and put them in the streets, make them
Hmm.
real. Sardillo definitely was a leader in that Romanician, and Hillman, of course, wanted to. Well, the one who broke through is, as you know, Tom Moore.
Yeah.
And Tom went through a lot to get to the place where his book finally got to Oprah and then became a bestseller. Tom led the way in many ways. But anyways, so I do think that what Hillman does in the Soul's Code and Force of Character is exceptional, and there's continuity with his earlier work. But the idea of fate, that if we can look back at our lives and see that all the things that happened, good, bad, ugly, were necessary for us to be the person we are today, and we can affirm who we are today, then it grants the mark of necessity to those horrible things. It doesn't make them good, but they have value. And one of the things that I found over and over again is people suffer the most when they think it's for no good reason. It could have been otherwise. That's where we get caught.
Yeah.
And necessity is a theme that runs all the way through Hillman's work. Um, that's a very powerful idea.
Hmm.
Ananke, it grabs you by the throat. And so being able to narrate your life and recognize necessity is liberating for people.
Yeah.
It allows them to settle up with that past.
Yeah. I mean, the acorn theory, the myth of that he gives in the Soul's Code, provides us as Westerners with an alternative story that has cultural depth for us, that allows us to look at our lives and read our lives backwards in a much different way than the ones provided by developmental psychology, trauma culture, etc. Right?
Absolutely.
I think it's so helpful, and I recommend to people all the time Soul's Code as a good starting point for their own soul work.
And I'm pretty adamant that, this is not a new age metaphysics.
Yeah.
Hillman is not saying literally that the soul chose these things before birth. He's saying, what if you were to look at your
Yeah.
life as if? What do you see? What does it bring into view? And Plato even speaks about it that way. If we believe the myth, it can redeem us. The whole value, the substance of the myth, its validity, is encased within itself. But it offers us a viewpoint that I think, as you're saying, is far superior to much of developmental psychology.
Yeah. And to also recognize that you're already telling yourself a myth about your childhood.
Yes, you've
And
already
and
chosen a way to narrate it.
yeah, and what could have been. And so what's that story doing for you? What's it doing to you? And so
Right.
maybe that myth, that story, that narrative isn't working for you in terms of you being the person you want to be and living the life you want to live.
And when you narrate that story based on going back to vernacular versus formal knowledge, the formal knowledge that we have here, how do we narrate our story, frequently comes from developmental psychology. And Hillman was persistent in saying that we frequently dull our lives by the way we imagine them, and he critiques psychology for its poverty of ideas. So if you have a crappy idea and you narrate your life looks crappy.
Yeah.
And then the other piece that coincides with this is like narrative therapy, White and Epstein, which talks about we narrate our lives as if we're the problem. We have what they call problem saturated narratives. And that comes from fundamentally mistaking our experience. Because when we're young, we think everything is about us, but that's why we need parents to tell us other ways of seeing. and frequently we don't have that.
Yeah, I love how what Hillman said. I think it was in the Soul's Code that it's not so much what happened to us in childhood, but it's how we remember what happened and what it means in our life.
Yes.
How it dominates the narrative of our life. And it's like every time we tell those stories of disempowerment, of victimhood, we're traumatizing ourselves over and over again. And he was trying to lift people out of that dominant narrative that is just perpetuated by therapy culture,
Yeah.
because therapy culture is capitalistic.
Therapy, and I hate to say this, but I think most, and this is, therapists are well-intended people.
Mhm.
They don't intend to manipulate people. They're trying to help people. But I think what therapy has done, remember that therapy took off in this country after the Second World War, trying to reintegrate all the veterans back into, the job market. So therapy has taught us to cope better, to be stronger, self-contained, heroic egos, so that we can be more efficient workers and more content consumers. And in so doing, it's perpetuated the very status quo, which has brought about a great deal of our suffering. So I tell people a lot of it is bullshit, and it's been destructive despite its best intentions.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean that there aren't techniques that you pull from these that are extremely useful. You know, Rollo May in '58. It's kind of funny. The first introduction to English-speaking audiences of this existential approach was Rollo May's edited book in 1958, Existence. And I was in a bookstore in Oklahoma City one time with Hillman, and the book had been long out of print. It was when books went out of print, you couldn't get them. He saw that book. He said, "Michael, buy that book," which I did. But in that book, what Rollo May says is that the existential analyst, and I think we could say also the archetypal analyst, has a fundamental understanding of the human condition. And that guides how it takes up different approaches. So it's not just a pragmatic whatever works. There's an eclecticism with regard, it's not eclectic, it's variability of technique.
Mm.
And you see in Hillman, I mean, Hillman is as Freudian in many, many ways as he is Jungian. And he pulls things from all over the place, but they're put together by his vision of what the soul is about and the meaning of a soulful life.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, there's some, yeah, I think that's an important part of what revisioning offers. And I think you see this as an important part of the practical application in the therapy room is that ability to be pluralistic, to take on many different perspectives and to analyze events from those different perspectives. And we get a sense of how our perspective shapes our attitude toward the event, right?
Yes,
And to be able to be fluid in that way and multifaceted and pluralistic is, or polytheistic in Hillman's words.
right. So that there's multiple perspectives that we take up. And when you listen to symptoms and then you see through them metaphorically, you gain access to those narratives which are going on in a person's life without them even knowing it. And then we can start to work with those narratives and recognize there are other ways to narrate it.
Hmm.
Um,
When you do that work with people, are you explicit in kind of naming the perspectives that you're seeing in play? Like, how much do you bring that metaphorical, mythic perspective into the everyday therapy? Does it depend on
I-
the client?
it depends. I don't do it too much, and I don't use mythology explicitly, but I do use ideas like from Hillman necessity, fate, the way we pay attention to things, the way we listen to symptoms. That kind of construct I present to people. And then it's each individual person. There's stories that are going on in their lives that we try and figure out. And uh, sometimes I tell people the therapy is like connect the dots. We're getting all these different pieces, and then all of a sudden we start to see a picture, a narrative, or a picture starts to appear. And then we have to ask, well, what is this doing for you? How is this making sense of you? What good does it do you? And who does it make you as a human being?
Mhm.
And coming out, one of the things that I think is so important in Hillman's work is this shift from from an isolated atomistic ego to a relational sense of the self. And this is something that I think every commentator that I'm listening to now is talking about in one way or another, because we need a greater sense of the common good. With the atomistic individual, the common good is I compromise a little bit, you compromise a little bit, and it doesn't work very well. When you're a relational kind of self, which I think is the natural way that human beings are, and we look across the scope of cultures and history, it's the way most people have been in most periods of history. This atomistic individual is more or less a Western anomaly that appears around 1750. People like Ed Sampson's work, the constructivist social psychologist who Hillman mentions, and he mentions him because Mary Watkins got him to read, uh, and he was a friend of mine as well. This kind of atomistic individual is an anomaly. When you move to a relational sense of self, you realize that we're in it together, that my good and your good are ultimately interconnected. And that means something. I'll give you an example. I have a client who I work with for many years, and we do a lot of business consulting because I do that as well. And we're walking to get coffee one morning, and this is a man who's been extremely upset about what's going on in Palestine, in Gaza, and deeply. And he has Palestinian friends, as I do. And we're at a street corner in affluent Santa Barbara, walking to a coffee shop, and he goes, "This whole thing is fucked up." And it was just like, it was profound. He saw that all the ways that we were living, the ways that we were interacting, and we saw the homeless person on the street, and we saw the Teslas driving by. He realized that it's all a mess.
Hmm.
That is important. That's a recognition that we need to have if we're going to move forward. There's got to be some fundamental changes. And in order to do that, I think we have to shift the way we understand ourselves and recognize the profound interconnectedness of the human condition.
Mm. Yeah. And I think, Hillman always talked about, psychology needs to go south. And by south, he was talking about Florence and that Renaissance mind, the polytheistic
Ficino,
world. Yeah,
Ficino, the
Ficino.
Renaissance, and Vico.
And as someone who grew up in Canada and has been exposed to indigenous culture here, and also been interested in shamanism for most of my life, and have spent time in Peru with indigenous healers there, I always thought, yeah, Florence, yeah, good, but like, let's go even further south, you know, to the southern hemisphere where a lot of these polytheistic worldviews are still alive and functioning. And I think it's interesting, after talking with Mary Watkins, that the liberation psychologies that she's kind of paired with Hillman's archetypal psychology so well, they all arise from South America. And there's a unique perspective that comes from the South, you know.
Absolutely. And I do, it's one of the places I gently critique Hillman that, he stayed Western.
Mhm.
And there's some truth to, he says, this melting pot that we're all in is cast in Western garb. And that, and as long as we continue to speak and think the way we do, we're Western. Um, but I came to realize after, in talking with people and reading, Hillman was moving more in that direction. He was more open to that, I think, at various points later in his career. But I agree with you completely. I mean, uh, the Chumash are the native people here in Santa Barbara, Carpinteria. And when I taught at Pacifica, it was the site of a major Chumash village.
Mhm.
And I would say, look at the Chumash lived here for anywhere from 7 to 10,000 years, and they lived a very good life. They were relatively peaceful. There was a lot of interaction with various tribes. They flourished. We're here 200 years and things have gone to shit.
Yeah.
What does that tell you? What have we missed? What have we forgotten that they knew? So I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of wisdom in indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and I guess part of that for me is extending the relationality beyond just between mere human relations. Like we've got to start there for sure, but at the same time, we've got to also be in better relations with the world that we live in and see that it is a complementary, symbiotic relationship. If the world is healthy, if the natural world is healthy, that's going to help us be healthier.
And that's when Hillman, when he talks about this relational self, the self as the internalization of community, he means it as informed by Adler's notion of social interest. And Adler himself said social interest is not just an interest in others. Um, it's like, it's not just an interest in the betterment of humanity, it's connection to the larger ecological world that we live in. And Hillman wanted to move in that way. He mentions that as well. I mean, and he says the most significant issue that we have is the crisis, the ecological crisis. He says that in many places, that is the issue. And the way we solve that, he says, is love of the world. And by the world, he means everything. He means the plants, the trees, the ground, the earth, all of these things together.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like because I actually got into Hillman through men's work. In my late teens and early 20s, having my own father issues, looking to people like Robert Bly and Michael Mead, introduced me to Hillman. And I was way too young, didn't have the educational background to understand Hillman at that time. But, coming back to him in my 30s, I began to get more of what he was talking about and my own interest in the wider world, not just my own personal healing program, uh, was met by him in that way. And so he was really helpful to me in expanding how I see healing. And I think like part of the opening that he had toward non-Western world views and ways of healing was really helped along by his engagement in that men's movement and people like Malidoma Somé and probably Martin Prechtel. I think it helped. I think it challenged him, his very kind of Eurocentric Western viewpoint. I think it helped him to open up more because I do see a shift in him, kind of in the 90s when he became involved with that. And then afterwards, it became so much more about the soul of caring for the soul of the world. And also him really coming out late in his life and saying, yeah, look, I'm an animist, okay? I think it was
Yeah,
remarkable.
yeah. And that was a period that I kind of lost touch with him. And then reading Dick Russell's, I think the third volume of the biography, I got filled in. And that certainly seems the case. And I kind of saw the results of that later in him.
Hmm.
And that was, yeah, it was a broadening and a deepening. I mean, Hillman was, as my friend Dan Chappelle said when I first met him, a seminal thinker. And there's lots of seeds in what he does, lots of directions. My reading of him is obviously got agendas. It's more phenomenological than he might have liked. But I think there's validity to seeing that when he talks about the soul's reality as archetypal, that it refers to that extraordinary depth in our experience, and that depth always has a structure. It's cosmological. It fits together. It's a world of experience, and that in turn places us in obligation as citizens to that world to engage and to act, and that's our highest calling. I think that strand, although it's only one in Hillman, is one of the most important in today's world. That's partly why I wrote the book. I said, he's really got something important to say to therapists
Hmm.
today. We need to help people, of course, bear their suffering and figure themselves out, but we need to help people enter the world in an engaged way as citizens. And without that, I don't see that we have much hope. In the United States, all the guardrails are falling away. It's up to us as citizens now
Yeah.
to be active. And that's why in the book, I put his archetypal psychology in the context of Sheldon Wolin's political philosophy, where Wolin is really talking about democracy, not as a form of government, but as fugitive. It's moments when a variety of people can come together from different perspectives and come together and make decisions based on the common good. It's episodic, it's fleeting, but it's been there throughout American history. We
Mm,
need those moments now so that we have enough power to scare the people who are in authority to make changes. And that's also the formula that, for example, Naomi Klein gives us, another Canadian, uh,
yeah.
that we need a lot of alternative ideas. And
Hmm.
that's where Hillman's work as a public intellectual has been important. He turned things around, as David Miller used to say. He always picked up the cup with the other handle. He questioned our certainties and talked about,
Hmm.
most importantly, that our unconscious today is economics. It determines how we see and make sense of everything. And we need those ideas to be widely disseminated. And then we need something to happen that is not taken as a problem to be solved, but as indicating an underlying issue. And have enough people mobilized by that to scare the people in power to make compromises. That's what happened with Roosevelt and the New Deal. That's what happened with Richard Nixon, with all the most far-reaching environmental legislation that we've ever had.
Mm,
Ideas like Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, the oil spill here in Santa Barbara with Earth Day, and it scared Nixon. And he put
mm.
these things, the EPA and so on. So I think this is where psychologists can contribute, and we are obligated, because things are so desperate, to help people become better citizens. And the way to do that is to have them recognize that we're in this together, and that part of the reason we suffer the way we do is that the world's gone mad.
Yeah, listening to you, I'm reminded of one of my favorite lines from Hillman that therapy should be a cell of revolution.
Yes.
And I mean, how would you characterize his idea of revolution? I mean, such a big part of it you've already touched on is somehow re-enlivening, reinvigorating the aesthetic response. And it's something that I've talked about a lot as an aesthete, as a musician, as an artist my whole life, and seeing how the aesthetic response has been deadened by our technologies, by our civic engineering, by our architecture, by the styrofoam drop ceilings and the fluorescent lights and all of that. But I appreciate something I heard you talk about in distinguishing between the naive aesthetic response and the critical aesthetic response. And that's really important because I don't recall Hillman really talking about having the critical aesthetic response. I mean, he was just really trying to open up people to the aesthetic and trying to recoup that in ourselves. But I think it's an important point that you make about the critical aesthetic response. So could you go into that?
Sure. And that has been one of the things I've struggled with forever. Since the 70s in Hillman's work, since the Anima Mundi essay, which kind of started this turn.
Yeah.
Um, the naive, he says that we have more wisdom without being educated, without any sense of right or wrong, just this aesthetic that goes out. And I've written essays where I said, well, that's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany with the rallies in Nuremberg. And if you've ever been to Nuremberg, they have the Documentation Center, which is all about the rise of National Socialism and how that happened. And the Nazis were absolutely brilliant at co-opting people's aesthetic response.
Mm.
My dad was a World War II veteran, combat veteran, but he always said they had classier uniforms than we did.
Oh,
They
yeah. From a
just
design perspective, I mean, it's incredible.
phenomenal, phenomenal. So that naive aesthetic response can and has been co-opted.
Mm.
So we need something more than that, something that sees through the appearance, and that's the critical one. So the place where I move to that is where Hillman talks about the education of the aesthetic response in terms of taste, an enhanced sense of taste. And where that comes from is an education in the West in the humanities and the arts and literature That gives us a way to fine tune that aesthetic response, to bring a critical dimension to it. And this correlates very much with Guggenbill's critique of Hillman as well. Although again, I don't go with a lot of that, what he says. But the point that I've made, I made from the beginning, and Giegerich makes it too, is the world has changed from that of the mythic Greeks. And so our aesthetic response can never be what it was. It has to have this critical depth. Now, how you cultivate that is in the practice of therapy is a very difficult thing. Um, I tell people to read literature. I
Hmm.
recommend books for them to read, and people bring in movies, films. We talk about music sometimes because those are ways that educate that response. Um, but what we face is at least in the United States, the decline of our educational system. People don't read, I had graduate students, doctoral students who couldn't write a grammatically correct English sentence. And they didn't knew nothing. I mean, they had an education in psychology where they would do multiple choice tests and knew some of the formulas. But you've got to read deeply and widely in order to get a good education. That's what we need. Now, that's a real challenge. That's where I'm struggling right now. How do you cultivate that critical aesthetic response? What the aesthetic response has going for it, of course, is that it's qualitative instead of quantitative. And in that very move, it strikes a blow against an economic unconscious. It says there are other ways to value things than cost analysis. And that's breakthrough. That's extremely important.
Yeah.
But again, being aware that that can be co-opted, it can be deceived, like the Apple computer. That's the next thing that people have to see. Look at things in the context. Look at their historical context. Use your informed imagination from the books that you've read, from the movies that you've watched, from the music that you've listened to, the dances that you've seen. Bring that to bear in making that qualitative judgment. Just don't stay on the surface, the first response. Go deeper. And that
Mm,
means you have to go slow. And one of the things that Hillman very much from the Anima Mundi all the way through the value of slowness.
mm.
Moving fast, we miss so much. Slowness is a virtue.
Yeah. And yeah, the quickness, speed is a kind of a function or a way of the way spirit moves. And the way soul moves is slow. I mean, you're going through the earth, you're going through the deep water. It's a slow, earthy kind of movement in a way. Yeah. And of course, he said over and over again, it was kind of the primary maxim of archetypal psychology is he got from Jung, but stick with the image, to really stay with the image. And maybe just to apply this to the aesthetic response and having an informed aesthetic response or less naive aesthetic response is to
More
stick with
sophisticated.
sophisticated. Yeah, good. Stick with the aesthetic response. Like, why am I attracted to this computer, or why am I repulsed by that Tesla truck?
Well, that's not hard to answer. It's ugly.
Well, it's something I've wondered about, myself. I see those trucks around town, and I
Yeah.
go, God, that thing is just ugly. But it's kind of like fascinating in its ugliness. I mean, it's just so bizarre. And that's kind of interesting to me. Is to
Yeah.
me, and when I stick with it, I go into it, I go, it reminds me of like early video games when everything was really kind of crude polygon shapes. They hadn't got the kind of the Bezier curves down yet. Processors weren't quick enough or whatever. And so to me, it looks like kind of like a puer fantasy of taking the video game car and bringing it out onto the road and getting to drive around in this thing.
When I said it was ugly, it's obviously my own perspective. I think what's really important is the way that Plotinus defines ugliness is when a thing goes over to another order. So when the human being thinks of themselves and imagines themselves as a computer, that's ugly because
Mm,
we've gone over to another order. Beauty is something showing itself as the thing that it is. Now, that might be horrifying, it might be scary, but it's the thing as it is. And then we can respond appropriately. And the notion of propriety has been as important to me in my work as a therapist and academic work as anything else. And it very much comes out of the classical rhetorical tradition. Propriety was the focus for Cicero of his ethics, of his politics, of its rhetoric. What is fitting? What matches? And this goes back to a common ground between phenomenology and archetypal psychology, that what it is to be a human being is not to be the master of the universe, but to be receptive. We're called to be, and that we become who we are in the choices that we make to the way we are called. We're always a response, not an assertion. And that is what's the appropriate response that stays with the thing as it is rather than goes over to another order. And so the appropriate response, I think, to much of technology is to resist it because it violates a cosmological sensibility. And that resistance immediately leads us into a political action that as citizens, we need to resist it. That's what we're called. That's the appropriate response. And like even in my dissertation, when I said the Walkman, I was trying to cultivate the appropriate response to the Walkman is to go, what am I doing here? What's happening here? I think it's one thing, but look at it. Look what's actually
Right.
going on when I
Why
wear
am
it.
I cutting myself off from the people around me, from the polis?
Yes. And what am I ingesting that's really not mine? But at first glance, I think it's mine.
Right. And is this thing I'm ingesting actually good for me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
The
so that's
fittingness, well, the appropriateness, I think that I just want to stick with that for a moment because it's reminding me of how much Hillman invoked the idea of the cosmos versus the idea of the universe. And he was really adamant about maintaining that view that we live in a cosmos. And he would go into the etymology of cosmos, that it had something to do with the kind of the fittingness of all things. Everything has its place and everything fits together, like in a very kind of like Taoist view of the world. Everything belongs, and everything has the right way to fit into the whole. And that maybe is our goal as ethical beings, is to figure out, you know, what we do, what we buy, what we create. How does that fit into the whole? To consider the whole of the cosmos.
Yes, and the notions of necessity and appropriateness are cosmological notions. Yes, and he says that cosmology carries with it a sense of purpose and a value that the notion of the universe never can. Because in the cosmos, we belong. When we talk about the
Right.
need for community, we belong in a cosmos. We're called to be, we're claimed by things. And then responding in the appropriate way, that's where justice comes in. Justice is the order, is the adherence to the order of the cosmos. And destiny or fate is how we're brought into it. And that's how I see these basic moves, and Hillman loved to make the moves from the archetypal to the cosmological to the political play out and why they're important today.
Yeah. And when we lose that larger encompassing cosmological story like we have in the West, then everything runs downstream from that, right? Like we lose our ethic, our sense of responsibility to the world. We're not paying attention to the appropriateness of things. Everything becomes more and more and more atomized into like, what does this mean to me? How is this good for me?
An
And
egocentrism that is profoundly destructive of the environment as well as our own humanity,
and it's kind of naturally heroic in
the worst
being
sense.
more assertive than receptive, which would be more an attitude of surrender. My yoga teacher talked about this a lot. He was really trying to rehabilitate this in his own way. But we look at the Hindu image of Shiva lying prone under Shakti's feet and surrendering to, what we could maybe translate in the West as Sophia is the intelligence of the universe, the ordering, the real ordering principle of the cosmos.
Yes, without that, we mistakenly believe we're masters of the universe.
Hmm.
And when the real becomes synonymous with what's quantifiable, then this idea of explanation, prediction, makes possible control. And it's through this rationality, this technological rationality, that we're mistakenly led to believe that everything is about us and we can do whatever we want.
Right, the
And
human entitlement. Yeah.
and we see where that has led us. And that's
Well,
the sin of hubris. We've gone beyond the measure
which was like
of
the
what is
greatest sin.
exactly,
Yeah. Back in the old worldview of the Greeks. Yeah.
because we have no
And
place.
yeah,
Every
and maybe
place,
even part of the Christian worldview that pride is the great sin.
yes,
Mm.
yep,
But it didn't have so much to do in the Christian view with the world, because the Christian worldview puts us here as the ones to dominate the planet of the natural world. It's just about this relationship to the higher God. But if we go back to the old view of hubris, there's that kind of the root of the hummus in there of humility.
yeah. And we have exceptions. We have St. Francis, but
Yeah, he was an
yes,
outlier.
exactly, exactly, an outlier. And it's unfortunate that Christianity has become all about otherworldly. Instead of when you look at the teachings of Jesus, they're very much this worldly.
Yeah, lift up a rock and I'm there, split a log and I'm there. I mean, that was left out of the big book. Again, this outlier of of Thomas and his gospel. Yeah, well, I think that's a good place to end it for now. There's so much that we could talk about, but I really appreciate your perspective and what you bring to this conversation around Hillman and I think his legacy and why it's important to keep these ideas alive and to keep what do we say, doing his therapy of ideas, and especially in our context as it changes. To me, they just become more and more relevant. And so it's been my kind of personal project to keep his ideas alive and to bring them to younger audiences.
I appreciate that. That's a great service, Brian. I mean, we need that. And with Hillman's passing, we've got to continue this work,
Mhm.
and keep it moving. And again, that's why I finally published this book after so many years. I thought this is important. Psychologists should be thinking in this way. This is where all these years of Hillman's thinking, it's really been ultimately to lead us to be better citizens because and there's nothing more important in the United States today than people taking up the role as genuine citizens and becoming involved.
Mm.
Otherwise, we're going to lose our democracy.
Yeah. I mean, he was so fond of quoting, I don't know how accurate his quote was, but quoting Aristotle and saying man is a political animal. And I think that's a hard one for people to grasp because, and this is something that he helped me expand my view of, but whenever I would think of politics, I would just think about, for us in Canada, the parliamentary system and all the campaigning and all of that stuff that goes on. But we're talking about political in a much broader sense, right? It has to do with the commons, where everything happens:
Exactly.
art,
And
literature,
that's why I
politicking.
turned to Sheldon Wolin, because what Sheldon Wolin did, and Sheldon Wolin was a professor at Berkeley during the free speech movement, wrote about that. I could go through more of his background, but pretty much contemporaneous with Hillman. But what Hillman fought against in psychology, Wolin fought against in political science. He tried to retrieve the notion of political philosophy, as Hillman tried to retrieve psychology as being about the soul. And his narration, he makes that distinction. Politics is about this affair and that affair. But the political is about those moments when people come together and are inspired to serve the common good. That's the and his work, and he's as literary and historically oriented as is Hillman. So it was a good match. And I found that Wolin's overall political philosophy has been a good place to situate Hillman's psychology at this moment.
Hmm.
And so I would, people, his book on fugitive democracy, yeah, there's a book called Fugitive Democracy, and then, hold on just a second. Oh, Democracy Incorporated is a really excellent book.
Hmm.
And yeah, and he too, like Hillman, was a public intellectual. I mean, you see, there's videos of him talking with Bill Moyers.
Oh,
And
great. One of
yeah,
my
and
heroes as an interviewer or a
yeah,
conversationalist, anyway.
yeah. So yeah, we got to keep this going. Keep the
Yeah.
work that comes out of Hillman alive.
And yeah, you've provided us with so many good references. I've been just making notes as we've been speaking. And so I'm going to include those in the description, and give people the little book that you published just a year and a half ago, I guess.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Um, yeah, it was a labor of love, and it was short because I wanted to just put this together in a way that was well, it's accessible in length. In terms of density, well,
I might send you
Hillman,
down some rabbit holes.
yeah, but I hope they're good ones.
Yeah. And so what's the title?
Psychological Citizenship and Democracy, the Political Relevance of James Hillman's Archetypal Psychology. So,
Hmm.
Psychological Citizenship and Democracy.
I think Spring, maybe they need another marketing person to come in because some of the titles, I just know the general readers are going to go, that sounds academic. But like Fugitive Democracy, what's
Yeah,
that?
that's
Democracy
Woman.
Inc.
Yeah, those are good titles.
We'll work on
Yeah,
that. Maybe I'll
you're
give them a
right.
call down there. I have a background in marketing, so it's I just my ears attuned to that. What's going to grab people. So
That's a good idea. Very good idea.
if you're going to choose a title for our conversation today, what comes to mind? What might be a good one?
Um,
Sorry to put you on the
well,
spot.
well, the Dallas Institute would have these conferences about different volumes of Hillman's Uniform Edition, and it would be about thinking with James Hillman. And I think it's about continuing to think with Hillman. And if the thing that I probably love the most about being with Hillman is he would think with you.
Hmm.
Was a great experience thinking with Hillman. And we have to continue to think with Hillman about our situation today. Thinking with Hillman about our situation today, that's what I would call it.
Nice. Yeah, I've been wondering actually. I've been talking to people over the past couple months about Hillman and his legacy, and lamenting that there's nothing like a Hillman Society or a Friends of Hillman like there are with Jung. Even in our small city down the road from us here, there's a Friends of Jung society that gets together and they have a library and all this great stuff. They have teas and tarot and stuff like that. And I'm like,
Yeah.
God, where are all the Hillman people? Where are the archetypal thinkers? Because those are kind of my people.
Yeah.
And the Dallas Institute did a great job for years of running those symposiums, right? But
Absolutely.
nothing's going on these days. And
Well, that's because it takes patronage. And Joanne Stroud was the patron for the Dallas Institute, and she's passed.
mm,
Steve Eisenstadt kept Pacifica going as a Hillman orient, and it's no longer the case.
yeah,
Um, Mary's not there. I'm not there. Ed's not there. I mean, there's a couple of people there too. I've certain Glenn Slater's still there, and he's a great
mm,
Hillman thinker. But no, it's no longer that what it used to be. So we don't have a center, a place that gathers together, these like-minded people, and we could use it. You're right.
yeah.
What's going on
Um,
at your house? When do we come over?
I know, I know. I was talking to Rick Tarnas just yesterday, and I kind of finished with this, wondering. And I was thinking, like, maybe it's something inherent to the kind of the renegade character or the outsider quality of Hillman and people who are into Hillman, like that just resists us getting together and forming a group. Um, I have a Patreon site for this podcast where people can pay and get stuff early and get little extras. And one of the things that I started was what I call the Lone Wolf Club, which is a kind of a paradoxical name, but I think sums up really like myself and others like me, where we are free thinkers, we are kind of independent minded people, we are kind of renegade, outsider, counterculture, but we also like crave companionship and community. And so like trying to push people outside of their little, outside of their cave, wherever they are, their hermit's hut, and just like get together and have conversations and think with Hillman. Yeah.
Yeah.
But to do that on a wider scale, I think would be so great and so necessary. And maybe someone out there listening will hear my plea and who's a better kind of organizer than I am and one of those magnetic people that brings others together, and maybe they'll hear and hear that call.
That would be great. That would be great.
All right, well, I really appreciate, we can't carry this work on without hearing the stories of the elders, and so I really appreciate you and all the others who have come on to speak about their time with Hillman and his influence on their work, and give us some ideas on how to carry it forward. It's so appreciated.
Well, Brian, thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk with you. And I sincerely enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can talk again down the road.
I would look forward to that.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
You're welcome, Brian. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.